So pinnacles. I kind of already went over this, but here's a pretty picture of pinnacles. Those are the central high peaks. Pinnacles is known for volcanic formations that are the central part of the park. And it's a fairly unique landscape amongst the whole area and has a very interesting geologic history. But alas, I am not the person to tell you about that. However, there is really excellent condor nesting habitat here. And it is one of the reasons that Pinnacles was selected as a release site for condors 20 years ago. And so those rocks have really great cavities that condors will nest in. So here we have Condor 589 on the left, and then a picture of a GPS unit on the right. And that's just to show you kind of what these transmitters look like that we put on the condors. And although it's a fairly large unit, the condors are big and heavy and they can handle it. So that number tag, the transmitter, it doesn't really bother them at all. So these GPS provide us a huge amount of information. Most of them give us a point every hour throughout daylight hours. And they're on the birds. They last 2 to 3 years. And so we do try to swap them out when they fail, but we get to get a much better understanding of how condors move across the land because of these GPS. So I am going to do a lot of maps. Here's the first one. Pinnacles is outlined in white. I think you can probably see it. And I think we're like up here. Is that right? Way up at the very top edge of this map. And I am going to say sorry right now because the next map is zoomed in just enough that Mount Diablo is off the map. I apologize for that. This map is one that I put together a little while ago that was to show kind of how condors have moved over the years. So here we have back in 2003 to 2005. These are all the movements of condors at that time that had GPS on them. So all these purple points you can see up here in those first couple of years after being released, we had a couple adventure up north, which was really interesting. You know, right off the bat, they're starting to take advantage of the mountains and move north. And then, but you can see also, of course, they're expanding out from the park here, and there's movement down here too. But what you don't see is any condors over here. And I'm just focusing on Pinnacles managed condors at this point. But 2006 and 2007, they discovered the coast. So the condors being released over in Big Sur and the condors at Pinnacles, they found each other and bam, it was just like back and forth all the time. They can do that flight in under an hour. It's amazing. They can make it over the coast much faster than I can. And so really interesting to see how all of a sudden just like they figured that out. And then what we have here is showing the difference between, in red, the 2006 and 2007 movements, and then in 2017 and 2018, like really not much change. So in 10 years there, you know, they're just expanding more and more in this area. You can see still a few points up here from time to time. But, you know, it seemed like they were just kind of focused and in that zone. And so in that time, you know, we're seeing condors locate different things on the landscape. And some of it's good and some of it's, you know, makes us nervous. So when they find communication towers like this, that's not too bad. Some have more stuff on them than others. I don't know if you can see there. That is a drum that is missing some of what's on the drum, and that was because of the condors. They are very interested in things and they have very strong beaks. And so sometimes they get into a little bit of trouble. So, you know, these things we keep track of, but in general, these aren't too much of a threat. But power poles, on the other hand, much more of a threat. Power infrastructure like poles, lines. We've had quite a number of condors over the years that have died from electrocution, and it's partly because power lines on poles are usually about 8 feet, and a condor wingspan is 9.5 feet. They really like to open their wings and sun. If they're sitting on a power pole like that one on the right, if they're up on top, probably not a problem, but if they're on the crossbeam below that, they can touch both wires and then they get electrocuted. Also, they can just run into wires directly, and same thing. So we've done a lot of work over the years to really try to minimize this issue. In all of the pens that condors are released from, we put a mock power pole in there and we run electric fence wire across the top of it. So when they land on that, they get a zap and they get a mental image that this thing, this shape is not a good perch. And it's done amazing training for the birds when they're in the wild. We really don't see them perching on power poles hardly at all. These pictures are from the very early days of releasing condors at Pinnacles. And I want to say since then, you know, we have a handful of times that we've ever seen them on poles, even though they're a fantastic perch otherwise. The GPS do really help us find condors when they've died. And although it's, you know, not what you want to see and not really what we want to be going out and doing all that often, the GPS there on that bird allowed us, you can see how intact the head and everything is there. We got to that bird within like 2 days after it had died. And that just gives us so much more information about why this condor died. If you come up on a bird that died 3 weeks ago, it's desiccated. There's very little that you can get out of information on that. So the GPS on these birds really do help us get out to them much more quickly. And we have a better chance of understanding why they're dying. In general, the issue is lead poisoning. And if you don't know much about the topic of lead poisoning, come and talk to me later. I'm not going to go into it too much today, but it's primarily from inadvertently ingesting lead ammunition that is in carcasses and food that they forage on the landscape. So if you're a hunter, please use non-lead ammo. The other thing that these GPS help us with monitoring the condors is finding what they do. And we find that they spend a lot of time on, you know, open working landscapes, farms, ranches. They really enjoy water. This photo is courtesy of the Ventana Ranch. They put game cameras out on water troughs just to see what might come around. And, you know, they had a whole condor party there one day. They've sent us actually many camera cards over the years of condors showing up. So, you know, we do see condors utilizing water sources that are out there. Yeah, there's a lot of concern over climate change, of like drying up water sources. We do feel like condors are potentially a little more insulated from that because they can fly such long distances and they can find, you know, water that's used for other things like cattle ranching. And while they're out there, of course, they're foraging. So I tried not to have too graphic of a photo for that. But, you know, here we have a young condor that has found a wild pig that is on a piece of property. You know, we see condors feeding on lots of different things. The smallest is usually a ground squirrel, and there typically have to be quite a few of those to bring a condor down to the ground. But, you know, we've seen them feeding on cows, pigs, deer, over on the coast, whales, seals, sea lions, things like that. Very rarely do they feed on birds. And then the really fun thing with GPS is that they help us find condors that are nesting. And when you study condors, you come to find out that they are very difficult to find when they're nesting. A condor pair, they will find some cliff, they go into a hole, and the bird sits in there for 3 days. And if you're just going out and trying to find a condor that's nesting, boy, good luck without some pretty extensive radio tracking and GPS equipment. But here we are, you know, we can figure out which cliffs. You can go out there, you can use, we have radio transmitters on most of the birds. You can use that to be able to like hone in on which section of the cliff, and then you just sit and wait and hope that they come out. It's pretty fun. So I'm going to go back to a little bit more with maps. So this is back to that map before of just them not really expanding too much beyond this kind of core area between the coast and Pinnacles and to the south a little. And I want to talk about some of the long range movements that we have seen over time. So this is one condor back in 2015 who in 2 weeks went from here, over here, down here, whoop, up here, came back down, and then did this jaunt all the way down here and up into the Sierra and around and back. It was amazing. First condor from Pinnacles who had ever done something like that we knew of, because it had a GPS. And it joined the Southern California condor flock down here, and we're pretty sure went with them up into the mountains, but not 100% sure on that. And then in 2019, we had another condor do a very, very similar thing. This one, same thing, up here, down here. This one went up the west side instead of this way. This right here is almost to Mount Whitney. So really cool just to see these big movements of the birds over time. And then just this year, this little beauty, Condor 1027 right here, she went from Pinnacles, which is here-ish, up, we see the same pattern, right? Up north, down here, and then she came down here, joined the flock of condors down there, has been spending, well, she went there in May and she's hardly come back. So we don't know if she's decided to move. We'll see. But she did come back to Pinnacles a couple times over the fall, but she is definitely just kicking it down here with those birds. So we'll, this is what we do. We just kind of track and see what happens over time. And, hopefully she'll come back, but maybe not. Maybe she'll join that flock down there. And then, as many of you mentioned earlier, we had condors come up this area. So this is one condor right here. September 7th, earlier this year, we had a group of 6 condors that made a journey up as far as up to this region. And so before that, they'd gone to Livermore. So it was the furthest north we had seen. And interestingly, this polygon is the Altamont wind area, which I'm sure many of you are pretty familiar with. We got word later that the condors flying over that area did trigger their eagle spotting equipment and did turn off the wind turbines, which was pretty interesting. We've been told in the past by other companies that that is not calibrated to condors, and so it may not work, but it was kind of cool to find out that it did in this case. But what's interesting is that a lot of the wind development up in this region, there's been very little thought that condors would be a consideration. And so we are working with Fish and Wildlife Service to try to bring that forward, that condors are coming up here. We wouldn't be surprised if they do it more often in the future. They have been flying up, north back since 2004. So they certainly could be in the area. So far, it does seem to be these jaunts where they come up and hang out for a day or two and then go back. But that doesn't mean that's going to be how it always is. So this is a map that I sort of put together for the Fish and Wildlife Service, just showing, we had this many condors inside the Altamont area, and that they could share that with others who might be interested in that in the future. And I think I wanted to just end with, if you see a condor. So should you see a condor when you're out and about, I highly recommend going to condorspotter.com. If you click on Central California, it gives you these colors. So when you see a condor, you got to look for the wing tag. You want to look for the color and the number that's on there. And when you come to this page, then if you click, say you saw a green 29, for example, you would click on the green. It will bring up all the green tagged condors that are out there. click on 29 and it will take you to a page that tells you about that condor. It'll tell you how old it is, where it was hatched, all this kind of stuff. So a little bit of facts about each bird. It's really fun. I highly recommend it. If you see one, send us an email. We definitely like to know when folks are seeing condors out and about, because even though we have GPS on a bunch of them, we can see kind of where they go, but we don't necessarily see what they're up to. So, and then with that, I just want to thank you, and I hope you learned a little bit about condors.